The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Private Emma Walsh pinned her worn name tag to her uniform for what felt like the 1,000th time. The metal was scratched and dented, the letters barely visible after years of wear, but she refused to replace it. This name tag meant everything to her, even if nobody else understood why. At exactly 6:30 a.m., Emma joined the long line of soldiers waiting for breakfast in the mess hall. Around her, younger recruits chatted excitedly about the big inspection happening later that day. General Rebecca Harrison, one of the most decorated officers in the military, was coming to review their base. Everyone was nervous and excited at the same time. Emma kept to herself as usual, carrying her tray to an empty table in the corner. She had learned over the years that it was easier to eat alone than to endure the whispered comments and curious stares. At 42 years old, she was much older than most of the other soldiers on base, and her worn appearance made her stand out even more. As she sat down with her eggs and toast, she heard the familiar sound of muffled laughter from a nearby table. 3 young soldiers were pointing at her name tag and making jokes she had heard countless times before. "Look at that old thing," whispered Private Jake Morrison, a cocky 22-year-old from California. "Why doesn't she just get a new one? That thing looks like it went through a war." His friend, Private Danny Kim, snickered quietly. "Maybe she's too poor to buy a new one. I heard she never got promoted past private in all her years of service." The third soldier, Private Rachel Green, shook her head with mock sympathy. "It's kind of sad, really. Imagine serving for so long and having nothing to show for it but a beat-up name tag." Emma pretended not to hear them, but their words stung more than she let on. She had heard similar comments from dozens of soldiers over the years, all making assumptions about her based on her appearance and rank. None of them knew her real story, and she had long ago stopped trying to explain it to anyone. After breakfast, Emma reported to her assignment in the supply warehouse. It was not glamorous work, but she performed it with the same dedication she brought to everything else. She organized inventory, filled requisition orders, and made sure every item was properly accounted for. Her supervisor, Sergeant Mike Thompson, had always appreciated her reliability and attention to detail. "Walsh," Sergeant Thompson called out as she entered the warehouse, "we need to get this place spotless for the general's inspection. She's known for checking every corner of every building on base." Emma nodded and immediately began organizing the shelves with extra care. She understood the importance of making a good impression, especially when it came to someone as respected as General Harrison. The general had a reputation for being tough but fair, someone who truly cared about the soldiers under her command. As the morning progressed, more soldiers arrived to help prepare for the inspection. Emma worked quietly alongside them, but she could not help overhearing their conversations about the general's visit. "I heard General Harrison once saved an entire platoon during a mission in Afghanistan," said Corporal Lisa Martinez, who was arranging boxes of medical supplies. "She's a real hero." "My dad served under her years ago," added Private Sam Johnson. "He said she was the kind of officer who would never ask her soldiers to do anything she wouldn't do herself." Emma smiled slightly as she listened to these stories. She had her own memories of General Harrison, though she doubted anyone would believe them if she shared them. Instead, she focused on her work, making sure every supply crate was perfectly aligned and every inventory sheet was accurate. At 11:45 a.m., word spread through the base that General Harrison had arrived earlier than expected. Soldiers scrambled to finish their preparations as news came that she was already beginning her inspection of the main administrative building. Emma felt a familiar flutter of nervousness in her stomach, the same feeling she had experienced many times over the years when important visitors came to the base. She touched her worn name tag unconsciously, a habit she had developed whenever she felt anxious or uncertain. By 1:15 p.m., the general's inspection had moved to the supply warehouse. Emma and the other soldiers stood at attention as General Harrison entered the building, accompanied by the base commander, Colonel James Patterson, and several other high-ranking officers. General Harrison was an impressive woman in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail. She moved through the warehouse methodically, asking questions about inventory procedures and supply chain management. Emma tried to make herself invisible as the general approached her section of the warehouse. She had positioned herself behind a stack of supply boxes, hopping to avoid any direct interaction. In her experience, it was better to stay unnoticed during these formal inspections. But General Harrison was thorough in her review, and she eventually made her way to where Emma was standing. The general paused to examine the inventory sheets Emma had prepared, nodding with approval at their accuracy and completeness. "Excellent organization," General Harrison commented to Colonel Patterson. "Whoever is responsible for this section clearly takes pride in their work." Colonel Patterson looked around and spotted Emma standing quietly nearby. "That would be Private Walsh, ma'am. She's been managing this area of the warehouse for the past 2 years." General Harrison turned to face Emma, and for a moment their eyes met. Emma snapped to attention, her heart racing as the general's gaze seemed to study her carefully. She was acutely aware of how shabby she must look compared to the other soldiers, especially with her old, worn name tag pinned to her chest. "Private Walsh," General Harrison said in a clear, authoritative voice. "Step forward, please." Emma's legs felt like rubber as she moved closer to the general. She could sense the other soldiers watching curiously, probably wondering why she was being singled out. She kept her eyes focused straight ahead, trying not to show how nervous she felt. General Harrison's gaze dropped to Emma's name tag, and Emma saw her expression change slightly. The general leaned forward to get a better look at the worn metal rectangle, squinting at the faded letters. "Private," General Harrison said slowly, "may I ask where you got this name tag?" Emma's mouth felt dry as she tried to find her voice. She was aware that everyone in the warehouse was watching this exchange, including the 3 soldiers who had made fun of her name tag that morning. "I've had it for many years, ma'am," she managed to say. General Harrison stepped closer, studying the name tag more intently. Emma could see recognition dawning in the general's eyes, followed by what looked like shock and disbelief. "My God," General Harrison whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emma Walsh, is it really you?" The warehouse fell completely silent. Emma felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, it's me." What happened next shocked everyone present. General Harrison, one of the most decorated officers in the military, reached out and pulled Emma into a heartfelt embrace. The watching soldiers gasped in surprise, unable to understand what they were witnessing. "I can't believe it," General Harrison said, her own voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, I never thought I would see you again." Colonel Patterson and the other officers exchanged confused glances, clearly having no idea what was happening. The young soldiers who had laughed at Emma's name tag that morning looked stunned, their previous mockery forgotten in the face of this unexpected scene. General Harrison stepped back but kept her hands on Emma's shoulders, looking at her with a mixture of joy and amazement. "You saved my life," she said loudly enough for everyone in the warehouse to hear. 23 years ago in Somalia, you saved my life and the lives of my entire squad." Emma felt the weight of decades of silence lifting from her shoulders. For so many years, she had carried the memory of that day alone, never speaking about what had happened because she felt it was not her story to tell. "Ma'am," Emma said quietly, "I was just doing my job." General Harrison shook her head firmly. "No, you were doing much more than that. You were being a hero." The general turned to address the gathered soldiers and officers, her voice carrying the authority and emotion of someone sharing an important truth. 23 years ago, I was a young lieutenant leading my first combat mission in Somalia. We were escorting a convoy of humanitarian supplies when we were ambushed by hostile forces." Emma closed her eyes, remembering that terrible day as if it had happened yesterday. She had been a young sergeant then, full of idealism and determination to make a difference in the world. "Our vehicles were disabled," General Harrison continued, "and we were pinned down under heavy fire. Several soldiers were wounded, including myself. We were trapped with no way to call for help and no hope of rescue. The warehouse remained completely silent as everyone listened to the general's story. Even Colonel Patterson was hanging on every word, finally understanding why this seemingly ordinary private had captured the general's attention. Sergeant Walsh, because that was her rank at the time, made a decision that saved all our lives, General Harrison said, looking directly at Emma with deep respect. She volunteered to cross 200 meters of open ground under enemy fire to reach a radio and call for backup. Emma remembered the terror she had felt that day, the way her hands had shaken as she prepared to leave the safety of their defensive position. But she also remembered the faces of her wounded comrades and the knowledge that someone had to act if they were all going to survive. She was hit twice during that run, General Harrison continued, once in the shoulder and once in the leg, but she kept going. She reached that radio and called in the cavalry that saved us all. Private Jake Morrison, who had mocked Emma's name tag just hours earlier, was staring at her with a completely different expression now. The cocky young soldier looked ashamed of his earlier behavior, as did his friends who had joined in the cruel jokes. After the rescue, General Harrison said, Sergeant Walsh spent 8 months in the hospital recovering from her wounds. When she was finally released, she had to retrain completely because her injuries prevented her from serving in her previous capacity. Emma touched her left shoulder unconsciously, feeling the old ache that still bothered her on cold mornings. The physical therapy had been long and difficult, but the emotional recovery had been even harder. She had struggled with nightmares and anxiety for years after the incident. She was medically retired from active combat duty, General Harrison explained, but she refused to leave the military completely. She requested transfer to support roles where she could continue serving her country. This explained why Emma had never been promoted beyond private in recent years, despite her obvious competence and dedication. Her medical limitations had prevented her from taking on roles that required full physical capability, but she had continued to serve in whatever capacity she could. The name tag she wears, General Harrison said, her voice filled with emotion, is the same one she wore on the day she saved my life. She's kept it all these years as a reminder of her service and sacrifice. Emma felt tears streaming down her face now, no longer caring who saw them. For more than 2 decades, she had carried the burden of that day in silence, never seeking recognition or praise for what she had done. The worn name tag had been her only connection to the soldier she used to be. General Harrison turned back to Emma, taking her hands in her own. "You disappeared from my life after that mission," she said. "I tried to find you to thank you properly to make sure you were taken care of, but you had been transferred and the records were classified." Emma nodded, remembering how the military bureaucracy had shuffled her from base to base as she recovered and retrained. She had never blamed anyone for losing touch with her former comrades. She understood that was simply how the system worked. "I've thought about you so many times over the years," General Harrison continued. "Wondering where you were, hoping you were okay, wishing I could tell you how much your sacrifice meant to me and to all the soldiers you saved that day." The general's voice grew stronger as she addressed the entire warehouse again. "This woman is the reason I'm alive today. She's the reason I was able to have a career, to serve my country, to make a difference in the world. Everything I've accomplished, every mission I've completed, every soldier I've been able to lead, it's all because of her courage." Colonel Patterson stepped forward, clearly moved by what he was hearing. "Private Walsh," he said formally, "I had no idea of your service record or your sacrifice. This base is honored to have you." Emma felt overwhelmed by the attention and emotion of the moment. She had grown so accustomed to being overlooked and underestimated that this sudden recognition felt almost surreal. "There's something else," General Harrison said, turning to Colonel Patterson. "I've been carrying something with me for 23 years, hoping someday I might have the chance to deliver it personally." The general reached into her briefing case and pulled out an official-looking document in a leather folder. Emma recognized it immediately as a military commendation, the kind given for exceptional service and bravery. "This is a Silver Star citation," General Harrison explained to the watching crowd. "It was approved for Sergeant Walsh 23 years ago for her heroic actions in Somalia. Unfortunately, she had already been medically discharged and transferred before it could be presented." Emma's knees nearly buckled as she realized what was happening. The Silver Star was one of the highest honors a soldier could receive, given only for extraordinary heroism in combat situations. General Harrison opened the folder and began reading the citation aloud. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, Sergeant Emma Walsh voluntarily exposed herself to intense hostile fire to secure communication equipment necessary for the survival of her unit. Her selfless courage and determination resulted in the successful rescue of 12 soldiers and prevented numerous casualties." The general's voice grew more emotional as she continued reading. "Sergeant Walsh's actions exemplify the finest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Army." With great ceremony, General Harrison pinned the Silver Star Medal to Emma's uniform, right next to the worn name tag that had started this entire revelation. The contrast was striking: the bright, new medal next to the old, battered name tag that had been through so much. "This medal belongs to you," General Harrison said softly. "It should have been presented years ago, but it's never too late to recognize true heroism." The soldiers and officers in the warehouse began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to thunderous applause that filled the entire building. Emma looked around at their faces and saw respect, admiration, and not a small amount of shame from those who had previously dismissed her. Private Jake Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his face red with embarrassment. "Private Walsh," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We had no idea who you were or what you had done." Emma looked at the young soldier with compassion rather than anger. "You couldn't have known," she said gently. "I've never talked about it. That's not why I kept the name tag." "Why did you keep it?" asked Private Danny Kim, genuinely curious now instead of mocking. Emma touched the worn metal tag thoughtfully. "Because it reminds me of who I was on the day I made the most important decision of my life," she said. "It reminds me that sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what needs to be done even when you are scared." General Harrison nodded with understanding. "That's exactly the kind of wisdom that comes from real experience," she said. "The kind that can't be taught in training exercises or classrooms." As the crowd began to disperse, General Harrison asked Emma to walk with her privately. They stepped outside the warehouse into the afternoon sunlight, away from the curious eyes and ears of the other soldiers. "Emma," the general said, using her first name now that they were alone, "I have a question for you. Why did you stay in the military after everything you went through? Why didn't you take your medical discharge and go home to civilian life?" Emma considered the question carefully before answering. "Because this is where I belong," she said simply. "I may not be able to serve in combat anymore, but I can still serve. I can still make sure that other soldiers have the supplies they need, that the equipment is properly maintained, that the little details are taken care of." General Harrison smiled with deep respect. "That's what real dedication looks like. Most people would have walked away, but you found a new way to serve." "Besides," Emma added with a small smile, "someone has to keep an eye on all these young soldiers, make sure they don't get too cocky." They both laughed, and General Harrison felt the same easy camaraderie she had shared with Emma all those years ago in Somalia. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years and the changes, Emma was still the same person who had risked everything to save her comrades. "I have another question," General Harrison said. "Would you consider a transfer to my command? I could use someone with your experience and dedication on my staff." Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. It would mean leaving the base she had called home for several years, leaving the routine she had grown comfortable with. But it would also mean working with someone who truly understood and appreciated her contributions. "I would be honored, ma'am," Emma finally replied. General Harrison extended her hand for a handshake, but Emma surprised her by pulling her into another embrace instead. "Thank you," Emma whispered. "For remembering, for caring, for making sure the story was told." "Thank you," General Harrison replied, "for being the kind of soldier, the kind of person who would run through enemy fire to save others. The military needs more people like you." As they walked back toward the warehouse, Emma felt lighter than she had in years. The burden of carrying her story alone had been lifted, and she finally felt truly seen and appreciated for who she was and what she had done. Inside the warehouse, she found that word of her story had already begun to spread throughout the base. Soldiers who had previously ignored or dismissed her were now looking at her with new eyes, seeing past the worn uniform and old name tag to the hero underneath. Sergeant Thompson approached her with a broad smile. "Walsh, I always knew there was more to you than met the eye, but I had no idea how much more." "I'm still the same person I was this morning," Emma replied with a gentle smile. "The only thing that's changed is that now you know the whole story." But even as she said it, Emma knew that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in years, she felt proud to wear her uniform and her worn name tag. She felt like she belonged not just in the military, but in the world. As the day continued, Emma found herself surrounded by soldiers wanting to hear more about her experiences, asking for advice, and simply expressing their gratitude for her service. It was overwhelming at first, but also deeply gratifying. At exactly 5:30 p.m., as her shift ended, Emma walked back to her quarters with the Silver Star medal carefully pinned to her uniform. She looked down at her reflection in the polished surface of the medal, and for the first time in a long time, she liked what she saw. That evening, she sat on her bunk and carefully removed both the Silver Star and her worn name tag. She held them side by side, two pieces of metal that represented different parts of her journey as a soldier. The name tag was scratched and faded, bearing the marks of years of wear and service. The medal was bright and new, officially recognizing her heroism and sacrifice. Both were important, both were part of her story. Emma smiled as she thought about the young soldiers who had laughed at her worn name tag that morning. They had seen it as a symbol of failure or poverty, not realizing that it represented something far more valuable, a lifetime of quiet service and unwavering dedication. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for her transfer to General Harrison's command, ready to start a new chapter in her military career. But tonight, she simply sat quietly and reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. The worn name tag that had once been a source of shame and mockery had become the key that unlocked recognition, respect, and new opportunities. Sometimes the things that make us different, the things that others might see as weaknesses, are actually our greatest strengths waiting to be discovered. Emma Walsh had learned that it's never too late for heroism to be recognized, for sacrifices to be acknowledged, and for quiet dignity to be rewarded with the respect it deserves.